Hello and welcome to the Nerdiest podcast on Spotify. Today we're on episode 12. We are going to go through some of Jack the King Kirby's work, his life and his impact on comics. Jack Kirby is one of the most influential names in comic book history. He has created characters like the Hulk, Thor, Iron Man, Spider-Man. Well, I say he created it, but he sort of co-created it. He is a famous comic book artist, and he's just a phenomenal powerhouse of a man and such an inspirational being. Like, it's quite intense of what this man has achieved throughout his long 76-year life. So yeah, this is what episode 12 is. Stay tuned. So yeah guys, episode 12 is going to be a comic book creator deep dive, and today's star of the Nerdiest podcast is none other than Jack the King Kirby, right? So, we're going to go through his life as not only a man, but a powerhouse in the comic book industry. His life from when he was young, how he broke into the comic book industry, and then we'll get into some of the superheroes and some of the most influential characters he created or co-created. The reason why I like his art style so much. And then at the end we'll go over his overall impact on comic books not only today, but comic books at the time that he was around, and how he was actively changing comic books, the way we perceive stories as he was working on them and as he was publishing them. So yeah, guys, this is going to be a long one. Yeah. So, the first ever creator deep dive, and it's a privilege to talk about Jack the King Kirby, because Jack the King Kirby is a powerhouse, like I have mentioned before. His story, his life story is so inspirational, and I don't think he gets talked about enough as a person, not only as a comic book artist, but as a person. He was one of the most influential people ever. Like, his work on comic books, it demonstrated that inspiration and that his mind, the comic books were a medium for him to channel what was going on around him, what he's lived through, his experiences into these books, into these stories. And we're going to start from the very beginning. So throughout this podcast, I'm going to be referencing books from this book that I have called The Art of Jack Kirby, which is like a 50-page book of just Jack Kirby knowledge and Jack Kirby's life story, his art, his early days, his later days when he joined Marvel, and some of his DC work as well. Jack Kirby was one of my dad's favorite comic book creators. I'm sure he was very inspirational to modern day comic book creators. But yeah, so that's what I'm going to be referencing. I just wanted to make sure that I had all the facts about this man, and I didn't mess anything up, because we're going through someone's life. It's not that easy to do off the top of your head just by revising it. So I'm so glad I have this book in front of me, because it's so much easier. Often associated with Stan the Man Lee, who obviously everybody knows from Marvel Comics, from the MCU. Obviously he's in the MCU, but he is also a powerhouse in his own right, I would say, for Marvel. But Jack the King Kirby, he has done so much for Marvel and the comic book scene that I think he just gets shadowed by Stan the Man Lee, because they often get paired together. So I'm not like having a go at Stan Lee, but I think Jack Kirby deserves some credit because the things that he produced were top-notch, high-quality pieces of work that still hold up to this day, right? These characters are still so important to people's lives. Born August 28th, 1917, Jacob Kurtzberg, I don't know if I'm saying that right, aka Jakey, Jack Kirby would stockpile inspiration from the people, their homes, and their lifestyles, and he would later learn to harness that and put it into his stories and his desire to tell good stories about real people. So his upbringing, it was very rough. He was born during the Great Depression. And obviously that's a big deal. And I think he talked about it in this book, and the Great Depression was a big, like, motivation to write these stories, because the stories are sort of like him channeling what he needed in those times, you know. You know, being born in the Great Depression is rough upbringing, and that will influence his work, his desire to create stories that resonated with ordinary people. A fast, intense, and later described self-taught art style. So his first job as a artist was doing comic book strips for newspapers, and obviously at the time that would be on and off, like you get paid at the door to do these comic strips. During the Great Depression, obviously that's important for people to have that sort of channel, that sort of fun in the newspapers. So the Great Depression is such a big aspect of this man's early life for sure, because it affects you when you're a child. A lot affects you. A lot stays with you when you're young, you know. So growing up during a great depressive era of life, that's going to stick with you, and you're going to channel that into your work, right? He eventually was a professional artist, was grateful to be employed and thankful for each paycheck, and very happy indeed to be working in the field that he loved. And it says here, a quote from Jack Kirby, "It seems all my life I wanted to draw," he says. "I knew that I wanted to try drawing comic art, and of course having a job was important. I was fortunate that I could have both." So he obviously working in newspapers, that's how he got into the comic book industry. Writing those comic strips, and drawing them. I don't know if he wrote them, but he definitely drew them. And it says he always wanted to draw, and he needed to have a job. So having a job where you're drawing is perfect, and he was fortunate that he had a job that was great. After years of imitating the drawings of his favorite Sunday strips and magazines, and nearly 2 years of steady practice at the studio, Kirby finally found his first job in publishing, late 1936. Kirby met Elmo, owner of a small newspaper art service called Lincoln News Syndicate. By spring the next year, Kirby was writing and drawing single-frame cartoon comic strips. But these are short, snappy cartoon comic books. So obviously, you're probably not expecting this from Jack Kirby, but obviously everyone's got to start somewhere. And he started working on small, funny, comedic cartoons for a newspaper publishing service. And he would be thrown around to different publishers, different newspapers, and so that's how he got into the comic industry. Kirby used bold lines and darker shadows to bring a mature and serious feeling to the strip. So his art style obviously would change over the course of his life. So in the early days, he would use very simple strokes and very simple lines, but it sort of carries over to what we know of that, obviously that, of what we know of when I think of Jack Kirby's art, I think of these bold lines and thick ink, like dark. It's just like a bold inking line. That's what I think of when I think of Jack Kirby's art. It doesn't look too detailed. It looks sort of like in your face and cartoony, right? So it pops like that, you know, because it's cartoony. I don't think it mentions it in this book, but Jack Kirby does eventually enroll in World War II. And then obviously that's so cool to me because he fought in World War II, survived, and then after fighting in World War II, he creates Captain America, which is so cool to me. It's just like, wow. But he doesn't do that yet. Superman leaped into the scene in Action Comics 1, releasing with a cover date of June 1938. By National Periodical Publications, later DC Comics. Jerry Siegel and Joe Shuster's introduction of a hero in long underwear did for comics what the Model T did for automobiles. The idea of a Superman ignited imaginations and quickly attracted new comic readers. So obviously the introduction of Superman is a big deal in comic book history. It changes the concept of what a comic book could be. So instead of having it a romance comic or a Western comic, it could be a Superman comic. And a Superman comic is anything you want it to be. It could be a superhero film, it could be an alien film, it could be something that you've never ever seen before. And that's why I love comics, is because every comic you open is different. It tells a different story. One minute you're watching Thor fly to Asgard, and then the next he's on Earth doing something stupid, I don't know. That's why I like comics, because when you have a Superman, it's not just a Western. It could be a Western, you could have Superman in the Western era, but you know what I mean, you could do loads with just that original Superman character, especially the fact that he has loads of abilities as well, helps have that creative freedom. Kirby was still knocking out strips for Lincoln News Syndicate when Superman fever hit. Superman was a fantastic thing to happen when it did. It broke new ground and made people think about creations they never dreamed of before, he reflects. It's also the single reason why the golden age of comics started, says Kirby. By the end of 1939, Kirby had discovered freelancing as a means of augmenting his weekly paycheck. Hiring him to produce a strip titled Solar Legion, a syndicated science fiction action adventure that never really got off the ground. So obviously, Superman Action Comics #1, it hits and it's a massive hit, and he says it's a fantastic thing to happen. When it did, it broke new ground and made people think about creations that they never dreamt of before. It opens that idea for him of creating these characters like the Hulk, like Spider-Man, like Captain America, Iron Man, you know. Superman was the first ever superhero, and he opened the doors for the rest of them. Meanwhile, the two were busy preparing a new character, one who would have the strength of 1,000 soldiers, enough to carry the weight of the nation's desire to squash distant threats looming over the horizon. Who could it be but Captain America himself? Simon and Kirby made history when the first issue of Captain America comics hit the newsstands. Late in 1940, cover dated March 1941. The cover art was dynamic and sensational. Captain America barging into a Nazi war room for a face-to-face with Hitler himself. Yet the United States was not to engage Hitler's Germany until after the declaration of war in December. Was it profit? According to Kirby, not any more than predicting the turn of the seasons. Kirby says, everybody knew we were going to get involved, he says. It was only a matter of time. We used the national sentiments of the time to get attention, but it was also how we felt. So obviously, Jack Kirby and Simon, they just channeled what they felt, what they wanted to get the attention of the consumer, of the readers of these books. They wanted to grab the eye on the cover. They wanted to make something eye-catching. And obviously putting Hitler on the cover of a comic book, it's bold, it's eye-catching, right? So that was a really smart move by Kirby and Simon. It says here, Captain America was a sensation as soon as it was released. The first major hit for Simon, who was a comic veteran of several more years than Kirby. The new title might have assured the team a long and prosperous relationship with Goodman, who was the publisher. The timely publisher was a savvy businessman, and he knew a hit when he saw one. And the hit he considered was not Captain America, but the two oddly matched young men that were now working for him. For that reason, he agreed to Simon's request to increase their pay rates. And that's it. So Captain America is released. He has his young ally, Bucky, and it's illustrated by Kirby. And it's a sensation. So you have Superman, the first ever Superman comic come out, and then you have Captain America. So you can see that you wouldn't have had one without the other, right? So Captain America is a superhero, but he channels what was relevant at the time. You see it now in comic books. They channel what's relevant to make comics relevant, but also to make the story relevant and to catch the attention of the reader, of the consumer, right? So their game plan was thinking way into the future of just getting into the reader's head and showing them something that is eye-catching, something that they don't expect. And obviously it's a famous cover to have Captain America barging into a Nazi room with Hitler on the front cover, carrying his famous shield, punching Hitler in the face. You know, that's going to get people to pick this book up. And they go on and they make a plethora of Captain America issues. They introduce the Red Skull. And, you know, Captain America nowadays is considered one of the best Marvel heroes. And I don't think, obviously, we wouldn't have had Captain America without Jack Kirby or Simon, or Joe Simon. His name is Joe Simon. We wouldn't have had these characters that we have today. You know, we wouldn't have had Captain America, the Captain America films. We wouldn't have had him in Marvel Rivals. And I don't think we would have had Marvel or DC. I'm saying this now, we wouldn't have had either of those without Jack Kirby's Captain America. Because it challenged what we knew as comics at the time. It said, we're going to do this, and this is going to be eye-catching, and people are going to buy it. This is what they did, and it just set a new bar, right? It just said, okay, we're going to go there, we're going to go, and we're going to make this sort of political in a way, but have fun with it. And obviously that's going to bring a lot of attention to Joe Simon and Jack Kirby for creating another awesome, very successful comic book character, Captain America. They go on to work for other publishers like Adventure Comics and Star Spangled Comics, and they work on Boy Commandos, and obviously now they're earning a lot of money, and you know, they are becoming names in these comic book communities. And then, he was drafted, like I said earlier, into World War II, and he was still keeping up with his art. He would draw portraits of fellow conscripts, and he would draw self-portraits, and he would keep up with his art during the World War II, which is obviously a nasty time for anyone to be involved with. And the war harnessed what was relevant, which was comics at the time, for propaganda. So the boy commandos were very much sort of like, it has Hitler, being beaten up or something like that, being ridiculed, being made fun of. And it just makes, it makes them shine, their image, the US military shine, and their image shine, It's just what they were doing at the time. I mean, they would probably do it nowadays as well. He was assigned as a rifleman and shipped out on August 17th, 1944 to join Company F of the 11th Infantry under General Patton. Private Kirby landed on the section of Normandy coastline designated Ohama, I don't know what I'm saying. Ohama, I don't know. It's a beach. On August 23, a little more than 2 months after D-Day. They still hadn't finished cleaning the place up. It was quite a mess, and I still remember parts of it like it was yesterday. It was horrible, horrible thing to see, says Kirby. Obviously, the war, that's going to affect your vision of life, and it's going to affect you for the rest of your life. And then Kirby was sent home in 1945. He served his remaining 6 months of duty at Camp Butner, I don't know what that, North Carolina. Okay. And he reminisces on how he was beat up and he had a bad case of frostbite on both feet and lower legs. They were considering amputation, but eventually recovered. It was hell of an experience. So obviously that's going to make you get sent home. He was sent home in 1945 and he was given a Bronze Battle Star on July 20th. He was gifted a Combat Infantry badge and a Bronze Battle Star. With the war behind him, Kirby rejoined his wife, but before long, Kirby grew restless and began calling on his old publishing contacts for work. Very little he found resembled what he had left nearly 2 years before. Kirby soon discovered that the industry had changed and that it was time to adapt. So after the war, he tries to join back into the comic book industry, but the comic book industry is an ever-evolving industry. There's always things that are going on and changing, and he had to adapt after the war, World War II, and become an even better comic book creator from that experience. So it moves away from sort of the propaganda stuff, and it goes into some more young romance, and it says here, Justice Traps the Guilty, which is a true FBI case and true crime comic book story. So, that's the sort of relevant thing. And he was just sort of clinging to what was relevant and doing some work in between. Obviously Captain America, that was sort of a war-related thing. It wouldn't become, relevant as a character on his own until later. But until when Marvel was established, he was doing sort of like rom-com comics, romance, young love, all these different comic series that were just trying to approach young loves and people who were into that. That's the target audience. He was doing the inking, the penciling, some writing, and he did some covers as well for these sort of young love books. As a rule, comics art in romance books contrast sharply with the excitement created by action-adventure art, because all of the action is in the word, balloons, and captions. Occasionally, we might show a car chase or somebody getting slapped. Occasionally, we might have a couple of guys get into a scrap over a girl, comments Kirby, but basically there was no action. Most of the story was in the writing. So obviously that's a big change from having Captain America, who is this big action star-spangled superhero, and you're going in to do a romance which was, as he said, the action was in the dialogue and in the writing, not really much going on in the art section. Then cowboys, this was sort of like the gateway to the golden age, or the sort of like the gate closing on the golden age and opening up to the silver age, perhaps. You got superstitious books, western books, young love was still relevant. They started experimenting with 3D comics. Which did not sell well, so they didn't try that again. He then went on to do some more sort of big 2-page spreads of art for certain comics, like Western books. He then did some sort of creature, black magic, superstition books, which sort of reminds me of the Fantastic Four books that he did for Marvel. Sort of the creature designs that he does, the aliens that he does, very, very sort of similar to the books that he does in Fantastic Four. So every comic book that he's ever illustrated affects the Marvel books that we know and love now. So even the young romance that could be related to how he draws women, how he draws the relationship between Reed, Richards, and Invisible Woman, that's probably from the young romance and how he does it so well, right? But let's get into some of what we know Jack Kirby's good at, what we know him for. He does some horror books, some young romance, some cowboy, but we all know him as the superhero guy, right? He's the superhero Marvel legend. And we've seen that he can do it. He's done Captain America. So he returns to Marvel Comics, which wasn't named Marvel Comics at the time. It was named something else. But when Kirby returned to Marvel Comics in 1958, the company's condition had not improved. In fact, in many ways, it had worsened. More furniture was stacked along the walls, files and art were created, and the atmosphere had changed from one of transition to one of imminent vacancy. In the middle of a largely empty studio sat the lone figure of Stan Lee, prepping art for publication from a now sparse inventory of early work. Kirby must have questioned his sanity for letting a personality conflict dictate such an apparently ill-advised career move, and yet the move had been made. He was determined to make it work. He had to make it work. Learning from Lee that Goodman was planning on closing the company, Kirby began thinking and talking all at the same time. Soon the spill of fresh ideas from Kirby brightened Lee's mood, and the two set out to convince Goodman to hold the doors open for a little while. So, Marvel Comics was at a low point before Kirby created, the Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, X-Men, Doctor Doom, these characters that we will love, Hulk, Thor, Submariner, Captain America, and the Human Torch. So you got to realize at this time, Marvel, yes, it has Stan Lee, but Marvel wasn't much of a company at this time. It was very much, it was sort of failing, right? It says here, furniture was stacked along the walls, files and arts were created, and the atmosphere had changed from one of transition to one of imminent vacancy. So obviously it's arguably the lowest point of Marvel's career is at this point. This is such a pivotal point for the company, for the publishing company, when Kirby returned in 1958. The first thing Lee and Kirby had to do was bring fresh art into Marvel's inventory. Most of the work Lee assigned Kirby was the bulk of the company's line of romance, supernatural, and Western titles. So obviously Marvel isn't just superheroes at the moment. It is, it's romance, supernatural, Western titles. It's all these all these sort of relevant themes, right? The first joint Lee-Kirby co-production was for a new science fiction book called Strange Worlds. Kirby wrote and drew the feature story, I Discovered the Secret of Flying Saucers, and penciled the cover of the first issue in a matter of days. Lee edited the story, and Christopher Rule inked the cover and inside art. Lee and Kirby next moved to Tales of Astonish, again joined by Rule. Kirby plowed through We Found the Ninth Wonder of the World, and penciled the cover in record time. The first issue was then released with a cover date of January 1959. So Kirby wasn't just a comic book artist, he was a businessman. He was getting those deadlines done. He was not messing around with those covers. He was inking, writing, and penciling these comics, covers, everything. He wanted to help Marvel become what Marvel is today. So Marvel was the publishing company. It's not the brand that we know it as today. The brands were, Journey into Mystery, Amazing Adventure, Strange Tales, Tales of Suspense, World of Fantasy. These were the titles that were selling. Nowadays you would have a Marvel book titled Marvel Spider-Man or Amazing Spider-Man. That's Marvel, right? It would have the logo on the front. But these were sort of pre-Marvel books that were titled differently. While his interest in these themes had always remained high, the results from his work in this genre were sometimes mixed. At times he appeared to struggle for new ideas, occasionally falling back to standby plots and creatures to fill gaps in inspiration. Yet most of the Marvel stories were fascinating and entertaining. A handful of them were unique and exquisite excursions into unknown realms. So it was just Marvel was just taking what comics were known as, and they were just being unique and just being interesting. Kirby says, these stories were more complicated and interesting. They involved the kind of blending of story types I enjoyed producing. In this case, it was the traditional monster and supernatural themes with the modern sci-fi fiction. So he was doing what he liked, He was producing these books that were modern sci-fi creature designs and sort of sci-fi space aliens and awesome stuff like that. Robots and aliens. It's so awesome. Suddenly, Kirby was busier than he had ever been in a while. In some ways, he had never worked so hard before. Kirby was now on course to finish nearly 60 issues for 1960 and nearly 90 issues apiece for the next 2 years. With only a few exceptions, Kirby's work appeared exclusively on Marvel titles until his departure late in 1970. Lee, too, saw a far more hectic schedule than he had experienced before. His duties encompassed a full range of management considerations, including editing, planning, and scheduling. As the demands of running Marvel's machinery increased, Lee allowed Marvel's artists more autonomy, with Kirby among these permitted the widest range of freedom. Lee quickly discovered that Kirby had principal strengths, creating new characters and stories, drawing them. Once Kirby was left alone to perform outside those two key areas, problems would crop up. One seemed from Kirby's weakness with continuity. A longtime Marvel staffer, John Romita, recalls, Jack would create costumes from page to page, costumes that would take most of us days to think of, and do this rather than look for the one he used in a previous issue. This was kind of creative power we were trying to harness. So it says, so I'm assuming that means like he was drawing costumes that were so eye-catching, but they weren't sort of continuity-wise, they weren't matching. And it says here, characters like Thor would cause Jack trouble. All the fans knew that Thor had 6 buttons on the front of his uniform, while sometimes Jack would draw 4, then 6, then 4 again, all in the same story. We got used to looking out for things like that, but the time we used up for making corrections was more than made up for by his overall productivity. I don't think anybody ever complained. Stan had also had difficulties handling the flood of new characters that were streaming from Kirby's drawing table. So obviously Kirby, the powerhouse that he is, he's creating these characters and he's overwhelming Stan Lee with all these characters that he's making. And that makes so much sense for the characters that were made. They're so cool, and like Hulk and Thor. So Hulk was one of the characters, like I said, it's not Marvel yet, but he was in Journey into Mystery, and he was this massive green Bigfoot-like creature. He wasn't what we know as Hulk today. And then Kirby started doing Journey into Mystery, like I said, starring the Mighty Thor. Thor was a character that was obviously created by Kirby, pre Marvel. So there were characters before the Marvel name and not the Marvel brand, right? So you'd have Journey into Mystery starring Thor. You'd have Tales of Suspense starring Human Torch, right? Human Torch was another character that was pre-Marvel brand, right? The Namor character, the Submariner, who, as he was named before Marvel, he was a character that was before. So these concepts were there. And Tales of Suspense had Iron Man, which was his first appearance in the grey suit, but that was before he was a Marvel character. And the same is here for the Grog character, who goes on to be a Fantastic Four villain. So let's get into the Marvel, So Marvel produced the Fantastic Four. And this is where it starts to get really juicy. As you guys know, Jack Kirby is famous for creating Invisible Woman, The Thing, Human Torch, and Mr. Fantastic, or should I say the Fantastic Four, which is a group of 4 superheroes who have supernatural abilities, and it's a very successful book for Kirby, for Marvel, and for Stan Lee. Fantastic Four 1 hit the stands with a cover date of November 1961 as a bi-monthly, but the reception for the title was so fantastic that Goodman quickly promoted it to a monthly schedule. Not since Captain America had Goodman's company published such a popular book, and this was only a beginning. Lee tried to exploit Fantastic Four's growth, To drag out every golden age superhero and villain Marvel had in its freezer. Kirby disagreed with the approach and argued that they should focus on new characters and new plots. The two compromised, and the result? Big bang of characters' introductions spawned what is now apparently called the Marvel Universe. So, the Marvel Universe was a compromise between Lee and Kirby as to having old characters that they set up and then new characters that they are going to make come together in a universe that makes sense in the Marvel comic universe, right? So this is before the films. Not long after the introduction of the Fantastic Four, Kirby was brought in on another hit idea. A little after his golfing game with Goodman, now watchful of anything that resembled a trend, noticed that sales of a particular plastic Frankenstein model were especially brisk. Again, he called in Lee, and again, Lee and Kirby collaborated on a likely solution to Goodman's hypothesis. The quick reply was The Incredible Hulk. The first issue of the book was released with a cover date of May 1962. So The Incredible Hulk was inspired by the Frankenstein monster, which I think is so true to what that character is. And you can definitely see the inspiration there. The Incredible Hulk failed to meet Goodman's expectations and was cancelled after 6 issues, with Kirby's art appearing on the pages of the first 5. Later, the Hulk was brought back to appear in issues of the Fantastic Four, the Avengers, and Amazing Spider-Man. Eventually, the Hulk reappeared as a regular feature starting with Tales up to Astonish 60 with Giant Man, then later Submariner, which we know as Namor, taking over the spotlight in issue 102 when the title was renamed The Incredible Hulk. The Hulk later became one of Marvel's most well-recognized characters, thanks to the long-running television series of the 1970s. Throughout the Fantastic Four life, in the comic book world, Marvel introduced new characters. Galactus, Doctor Doom, Silver Surfer, I don't know why I said it like that, Silver Surfer, and a plethora of other characters. And these are characters that are so famous to the Marvel world, and they make so much sense. That year, Lee and Kirby introduced 3 new major titles: The Avengers, and the X-Men, and Sergeant Fury and his Howling Commandos. So that's sort of like, that's cool. At this time, Marvel magazines were selling faster than Lee could get them out on the stands. Due to an earlier business fiasco that shut down an affiliate distribution company, Goodman found himself busy with the complicated task of pressing every advantage he could from Marvel's very limited access to distribution. All that meant for Kirby was that production for 1963 would be higher still. So, Marvel is now set up. They have set up the Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, Galactus, Doctor Doom. They are building their Marvel universe in the comics. This has never been, this has sort of been done before with the ongoing series, but this one is a collected crossover where characters cross over. You got the Hulk in the Fantastic Four, you got Spider-Man in Fantastic Four crossing over. So it makes people buy the books, right? So they introduced Spider-Man in Amazing Fantasy number 1. Wait, is it number 1? Kirby also introduced another long-time running Marvel hero called Iron Man. Iron Man was a concept of survival, Kirby comments. This guy could not survive without a specially designed suit. So with this suit, he made himself more powerful than he could ever imagine himself to be. He was also a god, but he was also a prisoner of his own invention, says Kirby. So as you can see, there's a theme, right? They start introducing all these interesting characters. Iron Man, Hulk, Spider-Man. And they are selling really well because they know what they're doing. They know what they're doing. These are just legacy characters for Marvel. And it's such a great eye-opening thing to see him channeling his sort of trauma, his sort of history as a young boy living in the Great Depression and writing stories that inspire generations and continue to inspire generations today. Let's talk about his early X-Men issues. While The Avengers was also a team book, it featured previously introduced characters: Iron Man, Ant-Man, Wasp, Thor, the Hulk, later Captain America. Each character came equipped with their own histories and personalities. Kirby saw it as an interesting challenge to put together a collection of heroes that we didn't want to let go, but that we couldn't throw into their own books. That was the interesting side of the pitch. Here were several personalities that were designed to be solo heroes, and we had to produce an effective portrayal of them working together closely. Of course, they'd argue, they might even come close to killing each other, but the idea worked, and we managed to make a convincing story out of a very improbable situation. So they created X-Men as a team book. So obviously, The Avengers is a collection of characters that we've already seen in the solo series, but the X-Men were just a handful of characters that were created for the team book. So you got Cyclops, you got Quicksilver, you got Scarlet Witch, you got Iceman, you got Jean Grey, you got Charles Xavier, Magneto, and you know, these famous X-Men characters were created for the X-Men. They weren't to have their own ongoing series, not until ages until they become more popular, right? So they wanted to have a book. He said it was a challenge, but it was important and a very improbable situation. So he sort of challenged himself in that way, and I think he did a really good job of demonstrating what he was trying to achieve with the X-Men. So the Avengers are sort of they are sort of heroes, right? The X-Men, they sort of could be hostile towards each other, and that's a whole new dynamic for these characters. They started doing team-up books with Iron Man and Captain America, and they started doing more books. They introduced Black Panther, Namor, Wasp, you know how I mentioned Ant-Man and the Wasp? Later issues of Fantastic Four became Kirby's main showcase of development in their style. The carefully drawn compositions of intersecting lines and shapes made Kirby's panels more intriguing and brilliant. My machines, no matter how unimportant they were, had to be so unusual that you couldn't figure out what you were looking at. I didn't want anybody looking at my machines thinking that they'd been seen it some place before. The new style was so unusual that artists had difficulty designating a name for it, so they called it Kirby-esque. I'm not sure. But that's really interesting that as he continues on with these superhero comics, his art style changes and it develops a Kirby-esque. That's something that I want to touch upon, is the Kirby crackle that he does is so cool. He does that for sort of the Silver Surfer, Galactus, Fantastic Four, sort of the cosmic characters have this sort of crackle, and it looks really cool. But that's probably because he did do his gallery, his portfolio for Marvel, was sort of very abstract and very sort of fun to look at. I'm looking at it right now, and it's like something out of Star Wars, sort of like Picasso meets Star Wars. It's really interesting. Colors popping, crazy lines and stuff. So, as his art style for the comics evolved, so did his normal style of art. His art overall evolved into something so cool. And I just love looking at his art. It's so good. So, Jack Kirby becomes dissatisfied with Marvel. After producing hundreds of issues of Thor, of the Fantastic Four, and creating countless iconic Marvel characters, and cementing his name, Jack Kirby, in the Marvel mythology, he gets dissatisfied, and other reasons cause him to leave Marvel. There are countless reasons as to why Jack Kirby supposedly left Marvel Comics. It was the peak of superhero comics. The resurgence of comics were coming back. Comics were as hot as when Captain America was released. The Flash, Superman, Batman, all these DC names are hot again. Marvel is still trying to catch up to the heat of DC Comics. Kirby noticed this, and when DC offered him a place to transition into DC Comics from Marvel, he was dissatisfied with Marvel. He was underpaid, and he was underused as they got fresh new talent in for Marvel. So when DC offered him an editorial role and his own series and his own freedom to do what he wants in that series, he took that offer, no questions asked. By late 1970, Kirby was running full steam on his new projects with DC. Kirby asked for the title that was selling the least and was not assigned to another artist. Jack Kirby takes up Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen, which at the time is the lowest selling DC comic book series, which is a bold move for Kirby. I think he wanted a bit of a challenge and a journey to embark on when he joins DC. And it works. He changes Superman's pal Jimmy Olsen comic series into a brand new fresh slate for DC, and it becomes a hit. It becomes a success. After his experience with Marvel, Kirby was bored with the typical superhero genre as he had been of love and romance stories 10 years earlier. Even the Marvel Universe crossover seemed transparent and ordinary. He discovered his answer in what he called the fourth world. From his new world, he wove a mythology within the stories of Mr. Miracle, the Forever People, and the New Gods. The tale was about super beings so powerful that they were gods compared to ordinary humans. Kirby, being the king of comics, when he was offered a new series at DC, he took it and he created his own superhero world, and he named it the Fourth World. And you have Mr. Miracle, and you have the Forever People, and you have the New Gods, which are like these new gods. It kind of reminds me of Game of Thrones on what he was trying to achieve. He was trying to build his own universe, sort of like Invincible. He was trying to, within DC, he was trying to build his own comic universe, so that he could have free reign over all these characters and have a start and an end to his own story that he could tell himself. The project was an ultimate exercise of the crossover story concept, and yet light years ahead of its time, which would ultimately be its downfall. Readers were not equipped to reading every single issue of Jack Kirby's New World, Fourth World series. you had to read Forever People, Mr. Miracle, The New Gods, just to understand the story of the Fourth World. And people were not into that. They were into superheroes, short, snappy, funny superhero comics. It was a overwhelmingly cool concept that I think could have been awesome if it was implemented in modern day today. Like, if it was made today, it would have been awesome. People were not prepared to read every issue, and DC cut the Fourth World series, which is a shame because the art was really good and it was a really cool concept to have your own universe within the DC comics. You have Darkseid, you have Orion, and you have other characters that were created by Jack Kirby for this new God's world, which we all know as DC characters today. Obviously, that is a shame that they cut his story, but he continued to work for DC throughout the rest of his career, and frustrated with comics and badly in need of a rest, Kirby ended his principal career in comics in 1978, closing 40 years of nearly continuous monthly publications. He finished his comics work with Marvel with a farewell cover for Fantastic Four 190, produced 2 new titles, Devil Dinosaur and Machine Man, and generated pencils for covers on other lists of work. Lee and Kirby also made comics history with their joint production of Silver Surfer, one of the first graphic novels produced in the United States. So he ended his career in comics in 1978, closing the door with doing a Fantastic Four cover for 190, which is obviously a nice way to end your career, right? With the thing that reinvented comic books and superhero comics, and back in the 1960s, right? His work, his whole work and him trying to build the Fourth World is so fascinating to me. His art style is super good. He is a visionary. He is a god amongst common comic creators. And I really dig his whole passion. He wasn't trying to get in anyone's way. He was trying to stay in his own lane, and he was trying to do his own stuff. And you can definitely see that. He channeled everything that he had lived into his books. Jack Kirby is the history of Jack Kirby is the history of comics. If you want to sum up comic history, sum up Jack Kirby's history, because he grows up with comics, and he reshapes the comics for the comics that we have today. We wouldn't have had comics like we have today, like Absolute Batman, we wouldn't even have continuous ongoings without Jack Kirby, I don't think. He was a visionary in comics and one of the best minds to ever come to the industry, in my opinion. That was the art of Jack Kirby, the history of Jack Kirby, and his overall effects on the comic book industry today. Like I said, he molded the comic book history as he grew up, through his personal endeavors, through his personal history. And I think it's such a nice story and such a nice, awesome way to end his comic career, on that 190 cover. I think it's really awesome. Yeah. There's so much I can talk about Jack Kirby. He co-created Captain America, the Fantastic Four, Hulk, Black Panther, Silver Surfer, Thor, Galactus, and the Fourth World Saga, including New Gods, Big Barda, and Mr. Miracle. All while serving in World War II as a combat infantryman in 1944. Jack Kirby died on the 6th of February 1994, aged 76 years old, in the United States, California. His legacy lives on in every comic produced today, and you can clearly see it. I was going to talk about Stan Lee's relationship with Jack Kirby, but I just don't think I will have enough time to talk about that in this episode, because there's so much you can get into with that. It's very controversial, it's very sort of like negative, and I don't really want to be too negative. I want to be positive. I want to talk about cool things and have fun talking about it. But yeah, Jack Kirby, everybody. What a man. He is a visionary. So yeah, that was episode 12 of the Nerdiest podcast on Spotify. Hope you enjoyed me waffling on about Jack Kirby. I found this man really, really interesting. And such an inspiration to comic creators and comic enjoyers alike. So yeah, if you like this podcast episode, share it with a friend. Let's end on a quote from Jack Kirby, shall we? If you look at my characters, you will find me. No matter what kind of character you create or assume, a little of yourself must remain there. Jack Kirby.